Yesterday, the Nashville Predators announced their official opening night roster. On today's Locked On Predators, we're going to talk about what does and doesn't surprise us about this roster, where the Predators start the season financially, and we have got to have a goalie talk.
You're Locked On Predators, your daily podcast on the Nashville Predators, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to the Locked On Predators podcast, and thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We are your free daily Nashville Predators podcast. We're a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Want to kick off this Tuesday episode welcoming any first-time listeners and, of course, giving a shout out to our everydayers and to our Locked On Predators insiders. We appreciate your support. We love that we get to talk Nashville Predators hockey with you. I'm Ann Kimmel. I am a writer with Penalty Box Radio, and my friends, I have a partner in crime.
You do. I'm Emma Lingen, and I'm the Predators site editor and reporter for the Hockey News.
Well, on today's show, we're going to talk about the final roster. Nashville's opening night roster is officially set. We're going to tell you what does and doesn't surprise us about this list. We're going to talk money. And friends, it feels a little bit like we've got to have a frank conversation about goaltending even before the regular season starts. We're going to dive into all of that in just a moment, but do want to let you know today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. All right, Emma, it is officially official. The Predators have submitted their official opening night roster. An interesting roster, not a full roster. They can have 23 players. They have 21. Let's go through this real quick. Not a ton of surprises here. Forwards, we have Forsberg, O'Reilly, Nyquist, Stamkos, Marchessault, Novak, Sissons, Evangelista, Tomasino, McCarron, Janowski, Smith, Parsonen. The Predators have 6 defensemen on the roster: Josi, Shea, Fabro, Lazon, Carrier, and Shen. Only 6 defensemen on the roster. And of course, 2 goaltenders, UC Saros and Scott Wedgewood. They do have of note, and this is something that we are going to dive into a little bit later, Spencer Stastney has been designated a non-roster player. He is somebody who I think we all expected would be on the opening night roster. When you saw this official opening night roster, Emma, any surprises for you, and what was kind of your initial thought when you looked at this group?
No real surprises for me, to be honest. I think especially once we saw, at this point, I had said this before, that I figured with Spencer Stastney, regardless of when he was to return or what the circumstances were, I think he regardless would have started this season in Milwaukee anyway, just after missing in the entire training camp. And so I wasn't a surprise. The only thing that was mildly surprising to me was the fact that Mark Del Gaizo did, get assigned to Milwaukee. But then again, the more I thought about it, and we talked about this yesterday, it does make sense. Like, I get it. You don't want him just sitting on your bench as the extra defenseman. Like, you want him actually playing in Milwaukee. So that makes sense. But, I did think, the max roster size in the NHL is 23 players. I assumed they would roll with fewer than that, just with their cap situation. I was assuming maybe 22. You get an extra defenseman, an extra forward. Instead, they decided to forego the extra defenseman. I would bet money that we see Mark Del Gaizo on this roster at some point this year.
Yes.
Potentially sooner rather than later. But again, other than that, no real surprises.
Mm-hmm. I think so much about this roster was up in the air, and we would be having a very different discussion on June 30th. as opposed to July 1st, because the minute you sign Stamkos and Marchessault, you know those two are on your opening night roster. And you know there are very specific players that are going to get an opportunity to play with them. You know, they're not probably going to bring up Fedor Svechkov to center Marchessault and Stamkos. And the outlook of this team changed dramatically on July 1st. And so that sort of eliminates some mystery. And there are some players who I think, had the Predators not made these moves in the offseason, would have made for a more interesting, more last minute decision making for the Predators. You know, we're talking Svechkov, we're talking Kimmel, we're talking Zachary Leroux, Ozzy Weisblatt. You know, those guys, especially Leroux and Weisblatt, really made a great impression in camp and put their best foot forward. But on July 1st, so much of it, I think, of this roster was really sealed the minute you brought in Marchessault and Stamkos, because A, 2 roster spots guaranteed, and B, there are only a specific number of players that you are going to play with them. So not a lot of mystery here as of July 1st, I don't think.
No, but I think that's a pretty good place to be in, considering that is, like you said, not at all where we thought this team would be
Yes.
last year. But again, I think it led to a little bit almost of, and we've discussed this on past episodes, of fans thinking that the team has given up on these prospects, or that they're just overlooking them and they're not giving them a chance. And it's like, no, the reality is they are still vital pieces of this organization and of this organization's future. They're just not ready right now. And so trying to throw them in the water before they can swim is not going to help anyone in this situation. So it's like, it's a good place to be in, that you're not forcing the Fedor Svechkovs and the Joachim Kemmels, into NHL roles because you don't have anyone else, just
Right.
because that's who you have. They as individuals, as players, are going to benefit from more development time. And then the team and the organization as a whole are going to benefit, reap the benefits of that a few years from now.
Yeah. So when this roster information came out officially yesterday, we went, of course, right to our Locked On Predators insiders to chat and got some great responses. Did have want to kick off with this question. Dustin said, "My big question is, when Stasney comes back, whose spot does he take, or is he once again on the outside looking in?" This is a great question. Obviously, like you've said, it's going to take Stasney a little bit of time, whenever, if under whatever circumstances he does choose to return to the franchise. Could start out in Milwaukee. He's on a 2-way deal. When he gets to Nashville, in whatever time frame that is, Emma, where do you see him jumping into this roster? Or again, like Dustin says, is he going to be in Nashville, but still kind of a little bit the odd man out on the blue line?
First of all, yes, I don't think there's any scenario in which he comes back and starts and is on Nashville's roster. I think he starts in Milwaukee for sure. That said, it depends on the circumstances in which he comes to Nashville. And I know that sounds like kind of a cop-out answer, like, well, it depends, but it really does, because it's like, why is he in, if he's starting the year in Milwaukee, why is he in Nashville? Did someone get hurt? Are they just bringing an extra person, for a long road trip? Like what, or is someone having a really bad year? Like, what are the circumstances? All of those factors play into what role does he play. Now, I think that right now, if he was on the roster, let's say he had been at training camp and he was on the roster now, it's hard for me to justify putting him in a role, an elevated defense role. And that's says less about him and more about just the guys who are in front of him.
The roster they have matters. Yes.
Yeah. And so I think it's like, do I think that Luke Schenn is going to bring out the best version of Spencer Stastney? No, but he also was there to stand up for his teammate as soon as he
Very true.
as soon as Dakota Joshua ended up in your invisible backpack of hockey grudges during the playoffs last year. So I think he will protect him, and that's great. But you'd like to see him get some more opportunities, some more minutes. But again, you're not going to be like, sorry, Brady Shea, like move over, you take your $7 million and go down to the third pairing. Like it just, it's hard. And I think, again, it's all going to be very circumstantial depending on, how he ends up here.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So much of that decision has less to do with Spencer Stastney and whatever situation unfolds with him and his, option to return to the team as it does with the roster that is in front of him. Here's what I will say. Spencer Stastney, and I would include Mark Del Gaizo in this, fantastic next men up, especially when you get Stasney back up to, playing speed and all of that. This is a great situation for the Predators defensively because the depth is there when they need it, if they need it, under whatever circumstances in which they have to go and get that. Coming up, we are going to hear from a couple other of our insiders, one of whom is willing to say this could be the best roster on paper in franchise history. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. This is the most wonderful time of the year for sports. Major League Baseball playoffs are in full swing. The NFL is well underway, and the NHL is kicking off this week. And the best place to celebrate all that sports action is with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. NFL fans, you can kick off your season with a big return at FanDuel. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's right, $200 in bonus bets guaranteed with your first $5 bet. When you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets. So check out the sports details and great deals at FanDuel. That's FanDuel.com, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, Emma, we were chatting with our Locked On Predators insiders yesterday when the roster was announced. Chris Davis had a comment, said, "This is exactly what I thought it would be once we knew Stasney would not be at camp. This team is in win now mode. This lineup is the clearest path to success." I have to say there was a ton of talent I think we saw at training camp, offensively, defensively, forwards, defensemen, young players. I would have to say I agree with Chris in that when I look at this roster, there are some players who may not be as glamorous as maybe you would want on the roster, but I do think it is a list of players, when healthy, do have this team in the clearest path to meeting high expectations this season. Would you agree with that? And are there any players where you're like, I would maybe swap somebody out?
Not a single one. I think that's kind of like what I've been saying and what I mentioned earlier about people wondering, well, why aren't we giving LaRue or whoever a chance? Because it's not because he's not good or he doesn't deserve a chance. It's because whose spot is he taking on this roster? Seriously. Like, even, I'm sorry, there are a lot of people out there who may not, like Mark Janowski or Cole Smith, or just because they're not volume goal scorers. Okay, fine. But that's not their game. And that's, you need guys like that. And I think the issue with the Predators is they have, for so many years, had a roster full of Cole Smiths and Mark Jankowskis, which is not like, those are not bad players to have. In fact, they're necessary players to have, but you don't want a whole team of them. And so now I think they're finally at the point where you have the correct ratio of Steven Stamkos and Marchessault to the Smiths and the Jankowskis. Like, that is a well-constructed roster, again, on paper. But I think that, that was kind of in years past, at least recently, that have been the argument about, well, give LaRue a chance, give Weisblatt a chance, give Kemmel a chance, because there were no there, it was all those sort of like depth players on the NHL roster. Now you have some legitimate star power on this roster.
Yes.
Beyond just that top line of the top three guys. And so I think that, like I said, has less to do with where, what those players are or aren't doing in Milwaukee. It's like, whose spot are they going to take? Like there's no one on this roster right now that I think like, oh, someone in Milwaukee should have taken that spot over them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned Mark Janowski, because he is one of those players who I think is not as glamorous, is maybe not somebody you see listed on the roster and say, man, I can't wait to see him play. Like perhaps you would say about a Zachary LaRue or a Joachim Kemmel. One of our insiders said the only difference is that Janowski is on the fourth line, probably instead of Parsonen. We're going to have to see how that sorts out. But I would always have expected Janowski to rotate around the roster as necessary, as he is a solid contributor. And that's that role that you're talking about. That is Mark Janowski's role. Where do you need a guy who can generate some playmaking? Well, hello, Mark Janowski. You can do that. Where do you need somebody who can bring physicality and win some board battles? Well, hey, I'd like you to meet Mark Janowski. He is, and I called him this the other day, and I meant no disrespect to either player, but he is a poor man's Colton Sissons, because he does a little bit of everything. And you want that guy on your roster. So while Mark Janowski may not strike people as the, oh my gosh, I can't wait to see him play, he is exactly who you want on a roster that is built to compete, because he can do more than a couple. He can do several things well enough to step in and not cost the team anything. So I loved that comment, and I love that you mentioned him, because I absolutely think he is a player where some people who maybe don't see his game regularly would say, why wouldn't we have given LaRue a shot there? Well, because LaRue can't yet quite do all of the variety of things with consistency that Janowski can do. And yeah, I look at this roster and I think I feel good about Janowski being on here. I feel good about the roles that they have gone out and gotten, and the roles that Andrew Brunette has filled. I loved this comment from Matt. And I thought now this is a spicy take, Matt, but I'm a little bit here from this. Matt said, best roster on paper in franchise history. Fantasy on paper for 500. I'll take fantasy odds over last year's roster at this point in time. Barry Trotz, that's one of his favorite sayings. We've heard it from Andrew Brunette. In the preseason, on paper, it's fantasy hockey. Nashville looks pretty good at fantasy hockey right now, but I think Matt has a valid point. When you look at this roster, this is one of the most interesting rosters, one of the most full of potential rosters I have seen from the Predators in a long time, because in your top six, you have an unquestionable top five players in those roles. And you can fill in that sixth player with a couple of players with potential. You have those depth pieces. You have that identity line. You have defense coming in that generates offense, but also plays a good, solid defensive game. And you've got goaltending, which we are going to talk about. Y'all, we need to have an intervention on goaltending. That's coming up a little bit later in the show.
You also have special teams. I think that's an important piece to point out too. And like, yeah, but again, I'm going to come in here for a second and, be true to myself and be a little bit of a pessimist and say, yes, I agree. Best roster on paper for sure. But if you're comparing it to last year's roster at this point in time, last year's roster, I feel like we all kind of looked at it. Everyone collectively was like, okay, let's see how it goes. And so there are really no expectations, and obviously they outperformed expectations with that roster.
True.
Now, of course, and we've talked about this before, but it's like now the expectations are considerably higher because we're not just like, well, let's just see how this goes. It's very clear, this roster should be better. And so now with those higher expectations comes the chance for, a bigger letdown potentially.
Very
And
true.
so I think that, like, yes, on paper, and we can be excited about that all day. But that's why I'm anxious to get the season started here, because I'm like, okay, this is great. We've been talking about, no disrespect to Steven Stamkos and Jonathan Marchessault, but we've been talking about those guys all dang summer. Like, let's actually see them play. Let's see how they, how they look, how this team looks in games that actually count.
Yes. And I wish the first game that actually counted wasn't against Dallas. But here we are, y'all. Thursday night. It's going to be against Dallas. And if you want a litmus test right out of the gate, that's going to give you one. I don't think it's going to tell you everything you need to know about the Nashville Predators because, again, and we have talked about this ad nauseum over the summer, these guys are going to need time to develop chemistry in games with, new line mates, new system, and all of that. But yeah, let's see what happens Thursday night, opening night. Oh my goodness. It's almost here. It's almost here. I will say too, looking back, like I was thinking about like that the 2018-2019 team after they had made that Stanley Cup run. Even when you look at that roster, and I think expectations were the Predators could get back to the Cup, I don't know that you still had on paper a roster that made you think, oh, like you do right now. Because in 2017, you didn't necessarily have those big name players. You had some kind of medium name players that played big. And I think now you have big name players on the Predators roster who, if they play big, can change things. So if everybody elevates their game, I think this could be the best roster the Predators have started a season with. But again, nothing matters on paper. It only matters on the ice. And we're going to see what that looks like on Thursday again against Dallas. I would just love that. A couple of players that we do need to talk about on the roster, not roster surprises by any stretch of the imagination, but can we please just have one more preseason conversation about goaltending? We're going to do that in just a moment. Today's episode's brought to you by Indeed. Just like your favorite sports teams, we are all driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites, according to a recent Indeed survey. Leveraging over 140 million qualifications and preferences every day, Indeed's matching engine is constantly learning from your preferences, so the more you use Indeed, the better it gets. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/locked on. Just go to Indeed.com/locked on right now and let them know you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Again, that is Indeed.com/locked on. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Okay, Emma. I think we just need to have one more cleanse the palate conversation about goaltending because, again, final roster, opening night roster is out. Of course, UC Saros and Scott Wedgewood. And you and I, fair and full disclosure, we have internal angst that we no longer have Kevin Lankinen here, but Kevin Lankinen wanted to vie for a starting position. He's with Vancouver. He may get that chance due to circumstances in Vancouver. God go with him. When you retire, let us know. The Predators went out and signed Scott Wedgewood. A number of people have said, I'm not real sure I like what I'm seeing from Scott Wedgewood in the preseason. I don't know if that was the right move, which then leads and spirals into a conversation about should the Predators have signed Wedgewood? What about Yaroslav Askarov? And we are circling the drain. Emma, I'm going to give you the floor. Kick off this intervention with your clearest and deepest thoughts on the goaltending situation in Nashville.
Thank you very much. I have seen so many people on social media and elsewhere just losing their minds about Scott Wedgewood and how this fan base has already turned on him because of his performance in the preseason. Now, let me start off by saying his numbers are not good. I'm not trying to sit here and say like, guys, it's not that bad. Like, he has yet to register a save percentage above 800 in the preseason. Not great. Like,
Not
I'm
ideal.
that's not good. Like, and I'm totally here for that conversation. It's not good. However, few things. Number one, he's new. He's new to this system. And we've talked about this before, but the way that the offensive system and defensive system, it affects the goalie. It affects the way that they see the ice and see the game. So there's going to be an adjustment period there. Second of all, goalies are notoriously known for being streaky. Goalies can be very streaky. And that is especially true for a backup goalie who is coming out of the offseason. If you think about it, it's really difficult for because goalies can train in the offseason and, during whenever they can, work on drills and things like that. But whatever they do, as much as they can hone their technique and everything, unless they're actually playing in a game, they're not playing, they're not going through the same scenarios that they would in a game. It's like they don't have guys in front of them, blocking them out or trying to screen them and trying to punch in rebounds and things like that. It's not the same. So, am I mildly concerned about Wedgewood's preseason performance? Sure. Little mildly. However, am I losing my mind about it? No. And also, I think that another thing to keep in mind here is that, first of all, again, if we go back to what we were saying before about the Predators having the best roster on paper to start a season, in theory, it should be a high scoring roster.
Yes.
In which case, that would give you a little bit more run support if you do have a goaltender and that lets in a few more than he should. Now, again, that's not an ideal situation to be in, but, I just think that, yes, I'm sure I know because I've spoken to them that both parties would have loved Kevin Lankinen and the Predators would have loved to come to an agreement if they could. He wanted to be a starter. He wasn't going to be a starter in Nashville.
Right.
And, they just couldn't come to an agreement. And I know from talking to the Predators and to their Department of Goaltending Excellence, as we, fondly refer to them, Scott Wedgewood was their first choice after Kevin Lankinen. And it wasn't, like, oh, I guess we'll take this guy if we can.
He's got a heartbeat.
Yeah, no,
pads.
They wanted this guy.
Yeah.
And his work ethic is incredible. I just, again, do the numbers concern me in preseason? Of course, yes. Below 800, that's not good. That is concerning. But I'm not gonna, sit here and say, oh my God, it's terrible. He is single-handedly going to cost the Predators their season. No. Especially with how, the flip side of it is look at UC Saros. Perfect 1,000 save percentage in the preseason. Not that he's had a ton to work with,
but a ton of minutes, but he's been real good.
Yeah, he's stopped every shot he's seen. So, I mean, there's that. But again, remember how last year was UC Saros statistically his worst season. And I think it had to do a lot to do with that whole situation with, bringing in Andrew Brunette and the new system and all the changes and everything. And it takes an adjustment period. And I think that that's why getting Wedgewood signed to a 2-year contract was important, because it gives you that kind of longevity there, and it gives him sort of that adjustment period. So again, you're also like, ideally, you're not going to be seeing Wedgewood as frequently in the regular season as we've seen him during the preseason. Like, he has essentially been the starting goaltender. Like,
so important. Yes.
He's basically been the starting goaltender in the preseason. But then also, like, you have Tanner Molendyk starting in the preseason. He's back in Saskatoon. So, like, all of which is to say, let's not freak out too much about what we see in the preseason, because it's preseason.
Yes. And I think that there is something in what you're saying that is so important, so basic, but so important to remember. This team is not counting on making the postseason on the back of Scott Wedgewood. It's on the back of UC Saros in net. Now,
and I think what people worry about
Mhm.
is that there isn't really a plan B if something happens to UC Saros and then Scott Wedgewood is suddenly your starting goaltender. You don't have the safety net of a Yaroslav Askarov, for example, anymore. And I think that is what concerns people.
Mhm.
But again, it doesn't concern me.
Yeah.
Like, at this juncture, it just doesn't.
Yeah. Let's trust the Department of Goaltending Excellence in this. And I would agree with you. Scott Wedgewood had a lot of minutes in the preseason, playing behind a system that that is very difficult to read, very different to read, I think, than what goaltenders are traditionally used to. The way that they exit the zone defensively, and the way that Andrew Brunette has the defense playing in front of the goaltender is different, at least than what they've done in Nashville. Of course, it's going to be a little different than what they did in Dallas. And again, this season is not going to be made or not made based solely on Scott Wedgewood, unless, knock on all of the wood everywhere, something happens to UC Saros. And then, in which case, and I think this is a mind shift for Predators fans, you still have other stars. You don't have to rely on your goaltender alone to get your team to the postseason. And this is a mind shift for the Nashville Predators fan base, because pre-Saros, Pekka Rinne years, so much of the hope of this team rested on how the goaltender performed. This roster, on paper, this fantasy hockey roster, is built very differently. So I think it's okay for everybody to breathe about the goaltending.
And this is what people have been saying too. All the people who were all these same people who last year were screaming, trade Saros, he's our most valuable piece. You don't need good goaltending to win a Stanley Cup. And it's like, okay.
But now you're mad you don't have good backup goaltending in the preseason.
Yes. And also, like, the whole you don't need good goaltending argument, if that's the argument you're going to stick with, the reason you don't is because you have guys like Steven Stamkos and Philip Forsberg on your roster. Like, that's, you can't, not to say you can't have both, but like, it's, teams have made it work with one or the other, and right now it's like they do have, on paper, they have both. And so, yeah, again, let's not lose our minds over our backup goaltender in the preseason, people. Like, let's all just calm down, please.
It will be amazing if the biggest frustration this Nashville Predators fan base has to work through this season is frustration with the backup goaltender, y'all.
Things could be so much worse.
Dream scenario here in Nashville. Dream scenario. But I agree with you. Let's cleanse the palate come Thursday against Dallas, where, just FYI, I'm going out on a limb here. Hot take, UC Saros will start in net, so you don't have to worry.
You heard it here first,
You
people.
heard it here first.
Not a
people.
Scott Wedgewood revenge game opening night against Dallas.
No.
I'm sure you are all looking forward to that, but no.
No, not going to happen. So, yeah, official roster. It is out there. We'd love to know what your thoughts are on this Predators opening night roster. You can let us know in the comments on our YouTube video. You can also join our Locked On Predators Insider program. That gives you a chance to communicate with Emma and I post podcast. We always like to run breaking news and hot takes past our insiders and get their takes. So, you can check out information on how to join the insider program in the description of this video or in the link in our bio as well. Emma, before we sign off for this Tuesday, will you let everyone know where they can find you and your work?
You can find me on social media at Emma_Lingen, and you can find my work at the Hockey News.
And you can find me on social media at AnnK_Mama on Ice. You can find my work at Penalty Box Radio as well. That is going to do it for this episode of the Locked On Predators podcast. Thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We will be back tomorrow to get you ready for that Preds opening night on Thursday. We'll see you then.